Thank you everyone for joining us today. On behalf of ECJ, we're honored to host this panel of industry experts to talk about an evolving and important topic for the food and beverage industry: CPG packaging and labeling 360, best practices for compliance, marketing, and legal. If you have any questions as we're going through our panel today, please feel free to send them in the Q&A at any time. We do have a lot to cover today, and we've gotten some questions through the registration process that we will incorporate. And we'll also try to address questions that you send in during a Q&A towards the end. If we're not able to get to your question, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards. And the session will be recorded, and we'll be sending a link to registrants. I first want to introduce our panel today. Melissa Grzybowski is the president of Food Consulting Company. Food Consulting Company was founded in 1993 and provides nutrition analysis, food labeling, and regulatory support for more than 1,500 clients worldwide. Melissa has over 10 years of experience as a US regulatory and nutrition specialist at the company, and previously worked in food labeling and regulatory compliance at Target Corporation. Vanessa Ting is the founder and CEO of CPG Growth Partners, where she serves as a fractional chief marketing officer for CPG food and beauty brands. She's also the lead strategist at Retail Path, where she helps high growth brands launch and grow their brands, both in DTC and retail channels. Vanessa has been a senior retail buyer for Target Corporation and a former CEO of Salty Girl Seafood. And my name is Pooja Nair. I'm a litigation partner and the head of ECJ's food, beverage, and hospitality practice. I work with both CPG companies and restaurant groups on a variety of litigation and transactional issues. To start, I'll give an overview of our topic. In March 2021, the FDA released its Food Safety and Nutrition Survey. And one thing that's clear from those results is that consumers are paying attention to packaging and labeling. Over 80% of respondents said that they were familiar with front of package claims. For example, no added sugar, whole grain, low fat, no artificial ingredients. And 87% of consumers said that they were familiar with the nutrition facts label and had relied on that label in buying products. So brand packaging and labeling present unique challenges and opportunities for CPG companies in the food and beverage space. There's a lot of opportunity from a marketing perspective to use that packaging to capture consumer attention. And then there's a lot of risk and challenge from both the compliance and legal perspective, from the compliance challenge of complying with FDA regs, and from a legal perspective of staving off consumer lawsuits afterwards, after a product is launched. So today we'll be talking about CPG packaging and labeling for the food and beverage industries from our three different perspectives: compliance, marketing, and legal. And to start, I want to ask the panelists, we've talked briefly about your background, and I'd like to just get into the specifics of what you do to help food and beverage companies think through best practices in brand packaging and labeling, just so the audience has a sense of the role that you play in this process for brands. Melissa, let's start with you.
Sure, great. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So Food Consulting Company's mission is to be your virtual food label department. So we want to make food label compliance easy, and we want to help you position your products in the best possible light. So we create services we provide are nutrition database analysis and the creation of nutrition facts labels and data for restaurant menu labeling. We help create compliant ingredient and allergen statements. We assist with all the other elements of your food packaging and labeling with label reviews and compliance checks, and make sure everything from your label claims to your net weight placement are all labeled correctly.
Great. Vanessa, what about you?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. So what I do in the world of packaging and labeling as a marketer is to first and foremost make sure that the product positioning is differentiated and of great value to consumers. So oftentimes that is extracting marketing claims to support that differentiation and that competitive viability. The second thing in which I also do is ensure that the packaging aligns with the brand identity. Part of the brand of your food and beverage company is conveyed through different consumer touch points, and packaging being a huge piece of that, not just in terms of demonstrating what the brand is, but also making sure that it sells itself on shelf.
And I come into the process a bit later than Vanessa and Melissa would. I tend to get a call because I'm an attorney based in California. So I tend to get a call if people have received a letter once packages and labels are, once the food product or beverage is on the shelf, and they might have some issues about a potential consumer lawsuit or complaints about advertisement or labeling. So I tend to help brands kind of deal with issues on a product after it's already on a shelf, particularly under California consumer protection law. So Vanessa, what do you see as key factors that food and beverage CPG brands need to consider when they're thinking about selecting their packaging and labeling?
Well, in terms of when they're selecting their packaging and labeling, I think really what you are first envisioning is, what is the packaging going to look like from an artwork standpoint, from layouts to colors to typeface and all of that. And the second piece, of course, is the copy. What are you going to say on the package that's going to get consumers, interested in buying your product? For the first aspect, packaging artwork, again, this aligns with your brand identity. This will all have been created, your packaging design should have all been created early on when you first conceived of your brand and, codified your brand identity. One important piece of that is how will that brand look like on a website? How will that brand look like on packaging? So, you really want to make sure that the look and feel is actually buttoned up much earlier in the life of your brand. The other thing to consider about packaging artwork is, is it going to be disruptive at shelf, right? Is it going to pass what I call the 3-second test, which is if a shopper is walking down a grocery store aisle and they are surrounded by a sea of SKUs and products and packaging, what will your box or packaging do to jump out at shelf? What will it do to grab his or her attention? Ultimately, your big goal is to get that consumer to pick up your product and look at it in their hands. That's more than half the battle. After it's in their hands, and if they like what they see, most likely it will go into their shopping cart. So you really want to be disruptive at shelf. And then, in terms of, and I'm going to stay away from the concept of like the shape of your packaging, that I think that's probably out of scope for today. So I am going to skip that. But in terms of packaging copy, when you're selecting your packaging copy, you really, of course, want to make sure that you're choosing in advance what marketing claims you want to use. We'll get into more about how to do that and how to work with compliance for that. But, you really want to have a good picture at the onset of what claims you want to make and, other romance copy, brand and product romance copy that you want to also have included on your label. So again, we'll get into more details on that, but just high level, those are the things you want to think about when selecting packaging and labeling.
And Melissa, from the compliance perspective, what are your thoughts on the key factors that brands need to think about when selecting their packaging and labeling?
So packaging and labeling is something to really think about in those like initial stages of product development. And, when all of these considerations are happening simultaneously, it means like fewer surprises at the end of, final label review and approval. Like, you're not finding out at the last minute that your claim can't be made or, the packaging isn't working with those messages that you want to make. So a good example that I like to reference is dual column labeling for nutrition facts labels. And depending on FDA's defined serving sizes and your total net weight of your package, you may be required to include nutrition information per serving of your product and also for the whole package. And I know that from a marketing perspective, it may not always be appealing to put the nutrition for eating a whole package of something. And so when we have these discussions from the very beginning of this product development piece, then we can work through like what are the implications in terms of regulatory. And if we don't want to put the whole nutrition of the package, how does that change our package size, our net weight, and those other pieces. And I can say the same thing for things like nutrition claims and the implications that they have with serving size and packaging. So, kind of having these conversations from the beginning and making sure everyone is on the same page from a compliance and a marketing standpoint really, really helps that process, definitely.
Yeah, and from a legal perspective, I think that it makes sense to be kind of involved last, because if you're following the compliance protocols, ideally you won't need to talk to a lawyer later once the product is on the shelf. But I think it's really helpful for brands to just do some research, either with consulting an attorney or just looking at what types of lawsuits have been filed involving products similar to yours, because even if sometimes you can do everything right on the regulatory side, and there's a risk because there are consumer lawsuits targeting that particular type of product. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't put that product out there, but you should understand the landscape of the kind of lawsuits that have been filed both by competitors and by consumers about products that are similar to yours. That information is publicly accessible, and it's easy to find. So you don't want to be surprised down the line. It's good to keep in mind that you might potentially have a risk of, aside from the regulatory risk, a risk of consumers complaining about your product or lawsuits being filed, particularly if you're selling to California consumers, because the vast majority of these lawsuits come from good old California under California state consumer law. So it's worth having an understanding of that just as part of that framework, even if it's not necessarily going to inform everything you do on the early side. It's just good to have that information. So Melissa and Vanessa, you both have the experience with working both with early stage and later stage companies. So some companies that are part of our, or in our audience today, are in the DTC space and they try to move into retail, or they somehow try to straddle both worlds. Can you talk about the different considerations from your perspective in labeling, packaging, and consumer disclosures for these two, these two areas, and how companies can move from one to the other? Melissa, do you want to start?
Sure. So my comment is pretty brief on this topic. That these spaces are kind of one and the same. So if you need to be compliant with the regulations on packaging, on retail packaging, and you also need to be compliant on your website. So if you've ever done some FDA warning letter reading, it's common to find that FDA has commented on information that they've found on company websites and issues that they have with not only that material, but material that's also on package. So keep that in mind. I think that's kind of a common misperception. Like, okay, I know I can't put it on my food package, my retail packaging, but I can just put it on my website, and that's not necessarily the case. So.
And for marketing, I agree with Melissa. They're really one and the same. Your PDP on your website should match what's on your package, and your DTC package claims and copy and artwork should mirror what is in your retail packaging. I know brands who are DTC first and don't have a retail presence sometimes focus a little bit more on the Instagrammable, right? The experience of the box and kind of the aesthetics. But retail packaging, when these brands launch into retail, really you should think about packaging differently. Obviously, one is it's to protect the product during transportation and life in the retailer supply chain. Oftentimes, you are having to add a UPC barcode at that time because that is information that a retailer needs to register your product in their system. Melissa or Pooja, maybe you even need the UPC barcode earlier than that. I don't know, but certainly for retailers you do. And of course, you now are considering what consumers are seeing on shelf and how to stand out on shelf in that busy environment and be shoppable. But generally, you really should be approaching all of these things, even the retail shoppability, upfront as early as possible, because the less times you can touch your packaging, the better. The more times you have to touch your packaging and print new packaging, that is a lot of wasted, inventory, and of course cost. So, always better to nip it at the bud and be proactive with all of this.
And Vanessa, a quick follow-up for you on that. If you've got a company that has, food in the food and beverage space, they've really focused on DTC, especially now. I know some companies that are in this boat where they've got an Instagrammable product, they're building a following, and they haven't really considered retail. What's the kind of advice that you might give them at that stage?
For when to consider retail?
For when to consider retail and how to kind of make that transition. If they hadn't done it from the beginning, I mean, I guess later is better than never. But I feel like I'm hearing more from consumers that are kind of not consumers, from companies that have been really DTC focused and haven't really thought about retail. So what would you tell them kind of at that stage?
For sure. For food and beverage, I think your distribution plan and strategy should always be omni-channel. So that means both online and offline in retail channels. Really the time that it's right to go into retailers is when you have really high velocity and sales volume, when you've got a great following on Instagram and great consumer demand, you're moving tons of product on DTC. That's generally when you're ready to go into retail. And remember, retail has a much more, I guess, mainstream audience than DTC, where you're able to reach niche audiences. So really, that's the first hurdle, right? Has your brand now kind of gone past niche and is ready for slightly more general markets?
Great. And now moving to more of a regulatory focus, we've said the word claim a few times already, and I think most of our audience is familiar with claims, but just to give us kind of a grounding framework, Melissa, can you talk about what we mean when we talk about a claim in food and beverage packaging and the label?
Sure. So FDA has definitions for several different types of claims. So there are nutrient content claims. So something like good source of fiber would be an example of a nutrient content claim. There are health claims that have been, there's been some scientific data to prove that these claims can be made, that food ingredients support different types of health conditions. So an example would be soluble fiber and the impact that it has on heart health. So those are defined by FDA. There are structure function claims, which talk about a nutrient and its role with more overall health and not a specific disease state. So something like vitamin C supporting immune function would be an example of a structure function claim. And then there's other claims that talk about the relationship with like a dietary guidance type claim. So if you're going to talk about USDA's My Plate in terms of food groups, then you can talk about that relationship to health if that applies to your product. So those are kind of a broad range of the types of claims that we talk about on food packaging.
And Melissa, could you, in terms of what the FDA needs based on the type of claims, I know that there's some claims that are subject to pre-market review or that you need to submit further information. What are the claims of the ones that you talked about? Which are the claims that you need to submit for pre-market review?
Those would be if you wanted new health claims. So those are ones that would have to be submitted to FDA. But the other claims you're allowed to make as long as you meet those definitions in the CFR.
And an ongoing question that I think we get, and I wanted to engage kind of in a dialogue between Melissa and Vanessa because you've got the marketing and regulatory perspective here. But what are your thoughts on how marketing and compliance can engage in with each other in the claims process? What are some best practices and just kind of thoughts from your experience on how brands can accomplish this?
Yeah, I'll jump in to start. I mean, it should be an ongoing conversation all the time. Really bring your compliance person along as a thought partner throughout the entire commercialization process. So, when you're still conceiving the product idea as a concept, when you're writing the product development brief, that is a good time to engage your compliance expert. At this point, you're generally identifying what marketing claims you potentially want to make, and you're providing direction to R&D, right, on how to actually, go about creating a product that will fit those claims. You might have claims about how many calories you want in a serving, or, how many grams of protein you want something in there, or you want maybe something gluten-free and non-GMO. All this is really important to run by your compliance partner in advance so that they can either, proactively tell you some things to watch out for, or if things are just impossible to do, they can start thinking about what testing might be needed in order to substantiate some of those claims. But you really don't want to, have this product created by R&D and, a prototype created and then find out that, and it tastes great, and then find out that you can't actually do it because of, some claims that you're making. So that's at least the very first time in which you should engage compliance. And again, periodically throughout the product development process, you should be checking in, giving them updates, communicating. And then also, as you are creating your packaging artwork files, so these are the files that are going to be sent off to the packaging printer to print, before you even send it out, well in advance of that, you want to send a copy to your compliance partner for them to review all the claims that are there, and to make sure that your labeling meets FDA and FTC requirements. And in some cases, at that point, they're also chiming in on, what documentation will be needed to back up those claims, as well as prepare for even retail or sell-in, making sure the documents are in place for retailers. So that's and generally, kind of what the marketing best practices are. But Melissa, would love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, that's great, Vanessa. I think you nailed it, because there's a lot of these, the claims that I talked about are some well-defined ones that FDA has, and then there's others, right? Like natural and other ones that we'll talk more about. But having those, really upfront conversations and figuring out what the marketing needs and the desires are to, talk through what's defined, where this claim falls, and then ultimately sometimes that means talking with a legal representative, Pooja, someone else, to get what's the real legal risk if we decide to go, with the route of X, Y, and Z claims or these other claims. And and I think, again, just having communication throughout that, and the regulations change and the legal environment changes, like we'll talk more about. I know Pooja's going to talk about some of the common class action lawsuits that are happening now, but we don't know what the future looks like for those. So maybe a claim that we make with packaging this time, it doesn't feel like a risk, but in future, as things evolve and different lawsuits happen and evolve, then that might create, some different risk assessment for what types of claims you're making. So yeah, that's what I would have.
Yeah, and just to jump in, also marketers, for any marketers out there, in the romance copy, this is the flowery language that we use on the back of pack to, to create some affinity with consumers. There's oftentimes language in there that you don't think is an issue, but someone like Melissa or Pooja will see that and flag that as an issue. So, there's just no way for a marketer to be completely, to be completely up to speed on all the different things that you can be wrong about. So, don't even try, just lean on your partners.
Speaking of the risks that we're talking about, I wanted to ask Melissa, because you see packaging kind of at early stages and draft labels, what are the common claims that you see that raise red flags for you?
So the ones that raise a red flag for me would be any of those claims that aren't specifically defined by FDA or FTC or some other regulatory body. So if you don't have a definition that you can go by, then as a company, you're responsible to come up with your own definition and determine what that substantiation looks like. So if you're going to talk about a natural or some other claim that we can't rely on a specific CFR notation to say we're meeting, then that that looks a little bit different than being able to claim something that's specifically defined. So those would be red flags for me. Also, when claims are made that do have specific definitions, then what I would look for is making sure that those exact requirements are met. So are things like this type size met? Are if it requires any type of disclaimer or disclosure, is that copy included? Is the type size for those requirements met. So, you know, even when your product does meet the requirement for the claim, are all pieces of the regulation and requirement being made on your packaging. So those are kind of the top red flags for me when I'm looking at claims on packaging.
And kind of echoing off of that, what I've noticed, especially in light of a couple of recent decisions, is and you covered it a little bit when you talked about the need for DTC and retail packaging to kind of be treated similarly, but I've seen places where in the category of it's not really defined by the FDA, but the company wants to make a claim like all natural or ethical or sustainable in certain ways, and then they need to link consumers to something on the website to actually define what that means. That's a big red flag in terms of if it can't fit on the packaging and it relies on your company made definition of something that's going to be complicated for a consumer to look at. It's something that I think we're seeing slightly less of now, but it's still something that comes across and sometimes somehow makes it onto the shelves when that definition is still pretty unclear for consumers, unless there's a judge used the term kind of playing detective to talk about it in terms of in the poultry context a couple years ago. And that if you feel like the consumer is playing detective by needing to really search through the website to understand what you mean by a claim, I think that's a red flag. And speaking of substantiating claims that are made in a package or product label, a couple of questions had actually come in about this. And Melissa, I wanted to talk, I know this is a really broad category, but can you talk briefly about the process of just kind of testing or confirming that you've backed out nutritional information correctly? Like what's this process like?
Sure. So first step is making sure you understand the regulatory requirements for making that claim. So what does the CFR state? What do you meet the claim per reference amount? Do you meet it per serving size? Making sure you have the regulatory piece really buttoned up to know that you can make this claim. And then, so for example, if you're making a gluten-free claim, making sure that you've read through the CFR and determined that 20 parts per million is met. And then understanding the implications for what that means for your specific product category, what that means from a facility standpoint, from a supplier ingredient standpoint. So this can look very different for different types of food products, and gluten-free is a good example. So if you're a facility that only does applesauce and the only sub-ingredients that you have are apples or other ingredients that don't typically have an association with gluten, your process for substantiation might look a little bit different than it would for a company that does produce products that have oats, for example, or have actual wheat in the other production line. So those types of discussions and considerations have to be thought through in terms of how do we substantiate that this gluten-free claim on package is met. And in some cases in the applesauce, maybe that doesn't mean necessarily having to do a gluten test on finished product, but maybe in your facility that has wheat in it, that does mean that you need to do gluten testing on finished products. So lots of things to consider depending on the claim that you're making and depending on your facility and your ingredient suppliers and that sort of thing. So the other one you mentioned is nutrition, and I would say the same for that. We do database nutrition analysis, so making sure that the data that you're using to create your nutrition information is solid and that the information you get from ingredient suppliers and now we have different requirements with dietary fiber and added sugars documentation. So making sure all of your information is in line to be able to create the nutrition facts that you need. And then determining, where missing values might be and how to account for that. And then in some cases, if you're making nutrition-related claims, that puts your product at more risk in terms of making sure you're meeting those nutrient content claims with your product. So lots of things to consider with that as well, and whether that means that you need to do lab testing or not, it's really kind of an assessment piece that has to happen.
And this is really a question for both Melissa and Vanessa. There's sometimes, whether based on like legal risk or pending cases, or just based on regs changing, companies need to walk back, right? They need to change their packaging, and they need to, or change their label, because they can no longer make claims that they were making. Either they consulted with compliance too late, or things changed about the product. But can we start with, from a marketing perspective, Vanessa, what is that? What kind of effect does that have if you have to reverse or walk back a claim?
Yeah, there's varying degrees of impact, if you will. You know, if caught early, the damage is minimal. If caught late, obviously there are really serious repercussions. But just to kind of go through some of them, you know, if it's caught, you know, early enough, you know, really the claim is so contingent upon the, you know, commercial viability and competitiveness of your product. So, you know, if caught early, you can perhaps try and work with R&D to come up with, you know, other, you know, attributes in which to turn into a claim that compliance would approve. But really it is, you know, oftentimes your revenue projections, you know, your shipment projections are all kind of based on how competitive your product is. And if you have to walk back a key claim that was, you know, at the heart of your competitiveness, that certainly impacts your revenue. Same thing with retailers. If you've sold in this product already to a retail partner, and they were excited about that claim because it's so differentiated and incremental, you know, you have to walk it back with them as well and manage that relationship. And not only is that disappointing for them, but that also impacts their forecasts as well. You know, if your product is already in the supply chain and you know, packaging, marketing claims have been printed on packaging, that is also a huge issue. Having to recall that packaging out of your own supply chain is expensive and you know, an executional kind of hurdle and nightmare. And it's even worse when when your product is in the retailer supply chain. That can cause some financial liability as well. And then there's, you know, if it's caught by consumers so much later in the process, then that becomes potentially a PR crisis. You know, for example, and this is a different category, this is in beauty, but, you know, very recently, there was an SPF claim made by this one, you know, sunscreen company or beauty company, and they had relied upon their contract manufacturer, you know, so that's the beauty version of a co-packer, but they have relied on their contract manufacturer to substantiate that SPF claim, which is a huge no-no. But they took it, you know, verbatim from their contract manufacturer, put it on their packaging. Later on, some consumer pulled the product and did some independent testing and saw that SPF claim was nowhere near what was being claimed on pack. And that was a huge PR disaster. So, you know, you have to really be careful about your claims, obviously. But that's an example of what happens when that claim kind of goes unsubstantiated and goes out of control and is already in market.
And Melissa, as the person who sometimes has to deliver the bad news in this way, anything to add to what Vanessa said?
No, I think that's the same. Like you just hate to have to backtrack off of some of those claims that you're making. So easiest to do it right the first time, right?
Yeah, definitely. So Melissa, talking about regulatory trends, especially now that we're entering a new administration, or that we're in a new administration, can you provide some insight into new regulations or regulatory trends that you're seeing that food and beverage companies will have to comply with?
Sure. So we have sesame is going to be added to the food allergy labeling law. It passed both the House and Senate, and we expect President Biden to sign it any day now. So that's something for food labelers to keep in mind is other countries have had sesame for a while now as an allergen, but it's new for us. So making sure, you know, products like tahini or natural flavors that have sesame in them are going to be declared in your ingredient statement or in your contained statement. Also bioengineered labeling. So the mandatory compliance date for everyone for labeling bioengineered ingredients is January 1st, 2022. So, you know, making sure you've assessed your ingredients and done the due diligence to make sure you have documents to confirm that you're not using bioengineered ingredients. So the list is short for bioengineered food products specifically, but the list of sub-ingredients that are made from some of these bioengineered ingredients is very long. So that will take some work to go through ingredients and make sure that those bioengineered labeling laws are met. And that's USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service was tasked with that labeling role. And so if you have questions on that, you can find information on BE labeling on USDA's website. And then also the uniform compliance date was released. So for any new regulations from 2021 or 2022, the compliance date will be January 2024 for that. So that's kind of a standard, date that is usually given for new regulations to be in compliance within about 2 years later.
And from the FTC perspective, we saw just over the summer, the FTC was basically came up with a new rule on Made in USA labeling. It's similar to the 1998 Made in USA standard, but really the difference from a legal perspective is that there's a lot more teeth, right? The agency can enforce the Made in USA standard, which is essentially that a product that says Made in USA on its label needs to have all or substantially all of its ingredients or components from the US and has to have final assembly in the US. And the difference between what we've seen with the new rule is that the FTC can enforce this with severe fines, and the penalties can also apply to ads, including social media ads. So the definition of ads had increased a lot. And I think what we're seeing with the FTC, at least over the past year, is that they're willing to take more enforcement actions. Of the FTC warning letters that have come out, almost a good chunk of the ones that have come out recently have related to COVID. So products, and this isn't just food and beverage. This is supplements, beauty products, all manner of products with claims related to boosting immunity or protecting consumers from COVID were the subject of warning letters. So I think there's about 140 FTC warning letters on that subject. And for the most part, the FTC didn't take further action. They gave warning letters and companies complied, which is generally how the FTC acts. But that's what we're seeing from them.
I would agree with that. I think that Made in the USA labeling tends to be kind of a confusing one for food companies. I see that often on label reviews where just because the food product was manufactured in the US, there's kind of this assumption that we can say made in the US, and that consideration of where the sub-ingredients are coming from doesn't always take place. So I think that's important. And the other piece that you mentioned, Pooja, is the warning letters coming from FTC related to COVID stuff. And I would say that similarly, FDA seems to be, like all of us, are kind of focused on COVID and those implications on our life and business. But it seems like from a labeling initiative piece, what they've been focused on is more COVID related. So warning letters related to supplements that are stating that they can help treat or prevent COVID. So those are some warning letters that I've seen also. And then looking at some ways for ingredients that had been planned to go to restaurants for food service use. With restaurants closed with COVID, they gave some exemptions for some of those restaurant food items to be sold at retail, and they didn't always have nutrition facts labeling. So giving some leeway for food manufacturers to sell at retail instead of restaurant because of some of those COVID implications. And then also they gave some enforcement discretion to restaurants who moved to an online ordering type system, who normally would have had to do some restaurant menu labeling. And so there were some exemptions for that when COVID really affected how restaurants were doing their menus. So some of those things will go away once COVID is no longer around, which we're hoping is soon, right? But those seem to have kind of taken center stage with FDA and what their work has been. Another thing is the work that they did on food safety and the transmission of COVID on packaging, and they found that that wasn't really the case. So those are some just a few other things that came to mind thinking about FDA's work currently.
So, thinking about lawsuits, Pooja, what claims are most likely to be the subject of a lawsuit, based on what you've seen for the past few years? Are there trends that you're seeing? What can you share there?
So it's been really, really interesting. And 2020, I was kind of surprised, but 2020 had the most consumer class actions related to food and beverage advertising ever. There was 220 class actions filed in that space. And of those 220, half of them, so 110 of these class action claims related to what was kind of broadly categorized as false labeling. So those range, it's a broad category. So it could be under or over reporting a nutrient. It could be saying that some of your ingredients are real ingredients or natural ingredients, or something like smoked, right? Saying that a product is smoked jerky when it wasn't really smoked, but there's smoke flavoring. So there's that broad category that includes kind of flavor related and process related. That's all considered in that false labeling window, which made a substantial amount of these lawsuits. What we've seen for the past 2019 was the year of vanilla and white chocolate. So I think there's close to 60 cases filed just about vanilla flavored claims. So I'm hoping that we're towards the end of that. Almost all of those claims were ultimately dismissed. So once a class action lawsuit comes before the court, what normally companies will try to do a motion to dismiss, and that if you can do that gets your case done at kind of an early stage. But if the case survives a motion to dismiss, you could be looking at years of litigation. We've also seen an interesting number of product origin claims. Like there's not a huge amount of them, but they're really interesting. So product origin just means, for example, there's a lawsuit about Icelandic skyr yogurt that was made in New York, but that was dismissed because the product says really clearly, it's made in Brooklyn. And there's cases about Hawaiian nuts that were manufactured in California, or Kentucky bourbon whiskey manufactured somewhere else. So those are product origin claims. And then there's also been it's hard to really see. There's a lot of different trends. And what we're seeing too is that there's a lot of ongoing kind of cases that are in a new area, which is environmental or social responsibility claims, because there's been, and I'm sure, from a marketing perspective, there's been an increase in consumer focus on wanting to purchase maybe more responsible things. And so companies are using words like sustainable or all natural or recyclable. And there's some claims about whether or not that's true. And as we were talking about earlier, those in some areas, those are undefined by FDA regs. So the company is making up their kind of own definition. And so in the lawsuit stage, it's a question of, is this really recyclable? What does that mean? Is this sustainable? And in states outside, and just keep in mind that the vast majority of these cases are brought in California. So, which basically means, because California is such a big market, that anyone selling products in California can be subject to the California consumer standard.
Wow, that's really interesting. And Pooja, how do courts evaluate whether a product label or package violates consumer protection and false advertising laws?
So the hallmark of kind of these cases is what's called the reasonable consumer standard. And reasonable consumer is something that FTC uses as well. But from the perspective of the courts, the reasonable consumer standard requires a probability that a significant portion of either the general public or of targeted consumers who are acting reasonably under the circumstances could be misled by a particular ad, product label, or something on the packaging. And so it creates this huge fundamental question, because what is the reasonable consumer and what's the reasonable consumer looking at? So initially, keep in mind in 2011, so 10 years ago, there was only 53 of these consumer class action lawsuits filed. So it's really exploded in the past 10 years. And that's really because in 2008, the Ninth Circuit, which is the federal appellate court that includes California, then the Ninth Circuit had this landmark decision called Williams versus Gerber, and in that case, the court considered what the reasonable consumer is going to think about, and this was a baby food case, right? And the front of the product had images of fruit, and the product had fruit as the name, as part of the name. And the court found that a reasonable consumer should not be expected to look at the side and the back of the box, but to correct misleading representations that are on the front. And that really reversed course. There had been a lot of court decisions up to that point that said if a disclosure is made on the box, right, if you can see it on the front or the side, and the company has followed all the FDA regs, and the nutritional facts are accurate and the label is technically accurate, a consumer should look at the whole thing, right? They should look at the box and consider whether or not the front, the name of the product or the image is actually reasonable. But after that Ninth Circuit decision in 2008, it kind of set forth this wave of consumer class actions. And it really comes down to what the reasonable consumer thinks about. And so it makes clear that you can't, even if you're doing everything right from a compliance standpoint and your side of the box and the back of the box is totally accurate, you meet the FDA label, the requirements on the nutrients that are put in, and consumers can see how much sugar is in a product or how many calories in a product, you can still be in litigation for several years about a product based on this kind of this reasonable consumer standard. So Vanessa, can you provide some insights about, we've touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail on the best practices on packaging from a design and from like the design and the product layout from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, well, I'm still digesting what you just shared about kind of the new hurdle, but yeah, generally speaking, you know, when you're approaching design and layout from a marketing perspective, you're thinking obviously about the front of the package, so that's the primary display panel, and then you're thinking about the back, and then, you know, the tops and the sides. And so the primary is obviously an important part of you know, being shoppable on shelf. And so obviously you have your brand name, your product name, you've got a telegraphic image. And by telegraphic, I mean, it is either a photo of your product or an illustration, but something to help the consumer understand what's inside the package. Then of course, flavor, you know, is important as well as, you know, some short product descriptions. You know, what is this product? Sometimes there needs to be just a short phrase or two to explain. And then as room permits, you want to layer in your key product claims, you know, gluten-free, 0 grams of sugar, whatever that is. And of course, work with compliance to make sure you're pulling out the appropriate claims. But, you know, 1 to 3 claims, you know, ideally in a spot that's very visible, because you're picking claims that actually drive purchase, right? You understand, as a marketer, you understand your consumer and what drives them to purchase. And so you're pulling out those claims and putting them in an obvious spot. Consumers read from top to bottom, left to right. So sometimes, you know, marketers will choose to put those product claim callouts, you know, in first position on the top left-hand corner, or maybe they'll bullet it down kind of below underneath the product description. And then in addition to those elements, of course, you want to make sure that you're following FDA labeling requirements as well, and putting in your net weight, you know, right font size, and all that good stuff. The back panel is where you put the rest of your product claims. So the ones you didn't have in front, you know, you want to put your secondary claims in the back, as well as some romance copy. So that's, you know, a little bit of flourish language about your brand or your product, cooking and serving instructions, and then the rest of, you know, the FDA labeling requirements like the nutrition facts panel, ingredient list, you know, where your product's, you know, made and who it's distributed by, and then use those top and side panels for fun, right? So this is like brand stuff, personality. So those are generally the best practices for how to lay out your copy, and, you know, across those different panels. And then icons are also especially helpful as well. And so icons for some of your claims, or icons, again, just to create some visual texture to your packaging.
And one thing from a legal perspective is that as I described in that Williams case, the image that you choose can really like have an impact in how the courts are going to evaluate what a reasonable consumer thinks about your product. So one really recent example where a case survived a motion to dismiss in California and is ongoing is about a product, Olympia beer, right? The beer was not made in Olympia, Washington, but the slogan that they used for the product was "It's the water," and the front of the product had an image of an Olympia waterfall, I guess, in Washington. And so even though there was product origin labeling that said where the product was marketed, because of the slogan plus the image, the court said a reasonable consumer could be confused. So it's interesting to think about, and important to think about your whole package, right? Think about what a reasonable consumer would look at and the entire taking into account the entire package, and that can make or break whether or not a reasonable consumer would think a product is from somewhere or has a certain representation. And similarly, it can benefit you. There was a case against Dunkin' Donuts about Angus steak breakfast sandwiches that Dunkin' Donuts ultimately won. And one of the reasons in that case, consumers had said a reasonable consumer might not know that an Angus steak breakfast sandwich doesn't really have like a piece of steak. But it's a cut up thing for a $2 or $2 to $4 breakfast sandwich. And in that case, there were ads that showed a close up of the product. So the ads showed what the consumer would be getting. And so the court found a reasonable consumer would look at the product and see, hey, it's a Dunkin' Donuts breakfast sandwich with the picture of what you were actually getting. And that helped to get the case dismissed. One question I want to ask, Melissa and Vanessa, you talked a bit about how marketing and compliance can work together and should work together and communicate as much as possible. But kind of a flip side of that, how do you see a tension between optimal packaging from a marketing perspective and from a compliance perspective? I mean, I definitely have seen the tension from my clients. That how do you handle that tension, and how can you, assuming it's not kind of the optimal situation where you have a compliance partner working toward, how do you resolve that tension as you kind of go through?
From a marketing perspective, yes, there's always going to be a push and pull because marketing's always going to want to push the envelope. But ultimately, marketing does understand the role compliance plays and the risk involved if we don't find a happy medium. I think marketing will be inclined to push compliance to check with lawyers on really what is the risk. Is the risk manageable, or is it really a deal breaker? But generally, marketing does end up ceding a bit to compliance because sometimes the risk tolerance of the company is not quite where marketing wants it to be, which is probably a good thing. But yeah, that is generally the tension.
And I would agree that tension and that push-pull absolutely happens. But, like we talked about before, if those conversations happen on the front end, then I think it's easier to work through that versus taking a package that a marketing person has spent all this time and energy and a lot of creative work to develop, and then to kind of have to tear it apart at the end stages is really hard to do. And so, creating that good relationship from the beginning, I think, is absolutely a key in keeping those tensions at a minimum, for sure.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we got a few questions. So I want to thank everyone for asking them. We're kind of almost out of time, and I want to get to the last couple of questions that we had. We'll try to follow up with the people who asked questions, and apologize that we just had a lot to talk about today with our topic. So Vanessa, can you talk about shoppability and disruption on the shelf? Like what are some of the best practices that brands can do to increase that? And can you also start by just talking about what you mean about shoppability?
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, shoppability and disruption on shelf is definitely the holy grail for a marketer. I mean, shoppability ultimately means, can the consumer find what they're looking for and understand quickly from your pack that, where your product fits in their decision hierarchy. So, for shoppability, how generally marketers approach it is understanding the purchase decision hierarchy, right? Like, what's the number one thing people are looking for when they're shopping your category? What's the number number two? What's number three? And I don't mean price, but things like, no sugar added, or, high protein content. So there'll always be kind of things that your consumer is looking for. And so, shoppability is being able to display that information very carefully so that they can see it and read it clearly and very quickly. Right back to that 3-second test, you want to grab their attention and get them to pick up your product to learn more. And so you have, very few seconds in which to accomplish all of this. But, the best way of making sure your product stands out on shelf is, there are the concepts of brand blocking or even color blocking. So this is where you have multiple facings on shelf. So again, this is in the retail environment, but you'll have multiple facings on shelf, and you'll want to maximize that loudness of those facings, right? And have that visual presence be arresting and stopping and stop the consumer in their tracks. So you do that through, visual elements, through color, through the use of color. That's why right now you're seeing tons of bright colors in the food and beverage category. Everyone is going after those bold colors to arrest you at shelf. But ultimately, the best test is to go into stores and put your mock packaging on shelf. Retailers will hate you for doing this. Just don't tell them, and don't photograph any evidence. Just, push aside space on a shelf, put your packaging up, and stand back. That is always the best test of whether or not your packaging is disruptive. You can look at it on screen. You can even look at it on a planogram on your screen, but you're never going to get the same real feel for how much your product stands out on shelf until you actually go into store and step back.
And Melissa, I just wanted to end with takeaways. So just we're right at the end of the time, but just in a minute or two, can you give us some takeaways that that companies can use to improve their best practices in labeling and packaging?
Sure. So, Vanessa talked about it earlier, like use your team and use your people, and, everyone can play a role in making sure that the product sells and the product is compliant. And so I think if you need help with these pieces, it's best to go to the experts. I know we had a Q&A that came in on where's the best place to find the regulations and look at them. And, there's the FDA website, and there's resources, and they're out there, but it's good to go to experts, and it's good to rely on the people that do this work and get help in those areas. So yeah, it's been great talking with both of you in the roundtable. It's been fun, and I know there's lots of questions that came in, and so I'm happy to help with any of the regulatory questions after the meeting too, because I know we won't get to them. But thank you, Pooja.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Vanessa, you want to just give any takeaways? Thank you both so much for participating. Thank you for the audience. This will be recorded, and this has been recorded, and we'll send a link out. But really appreciate you taking the time to be with us on this Monday afternoon. And Vanessa, I'll let you have the last word.
I guess my takeaway or last piece of advice is for emerging brands. Just know that when you launch your packaging the very first time, most likely you are going to go through a packaging refresh within 2 to 3 years. There's a variety of reasons why that happens, but I guarantee it'll happen. So just plan for that, and then bear in mind everything that we've mentioned today, so that when you do go through that packaging refresh, you're buttoned up and have eliminated as much risk as possible.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you. This was such a great conversation. And we're going to end with the slide that will have our contact information. So please feel free to reach out.